Good evening, everyone. I'm Louise Mirror, New York Historical Society's president and CEO, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to tonight's virtual program, A Conversation with Martin Barron. This program is presented as part of the Diamonstein-Spielvogel Forum on History and the Public Good, a series that provides a forum for distinguished public intellectuals to reflect on history and memory with a focus on civic leadership, public affairs, and diplomacy. The series is deeply rooted in Barbara Lee Diamonstein-Spielvogel and Carl Spielvogel's dedication to inclusiveness and social equity. We are so very grateful to Dr. Diamonstein-Spielvogel and Ambassador Spielvogel for making this series possible. And I know that the two of you are with us this evening, so I want to extend a special, heartfelt, personal thanks to both of you for making this program possible. Now then, just before I introduce our speakers, I want to recognize some New York historical trustees who have joined us this evening. The chair of our executive committee, Richard Reese, the chair of our chairman's council, Susan Danilo, and trustee Edward Hintz. I'd also like to thank members of our chairman's council. It's with such gratitude that I say to you, your encouragement and support, especially during this challenging time, has been invaluable. We are honored this evening to welcome Martin Barron, who became executive editor of the Washington Post in 2013. Mr. Barron oversees the Post's print and digital news operations and a staff of more than 800 journalists. Newsrooms under his leadership have won 17 Pulitzer Prizes, including 10 at the Washington Post, 1 at the Miami Herald, and 6 at the Boston Globe, where he previously served as editor. Our moderator this evening is Alberto Ibargüen, President and CEO of the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, and the former publisher of the Miami Herald and El Nuevo Herald. During his tenure, the Miami Herald won 3 Pulitzer Prizes, and El Nuevo Herald won Spain's Ortega y Gasset Prize for Excellence in Journalism. He's also the former board chair of PBS and of the museum in Washington, D.C. Tonight's program will last about an hour, including 15 minutes for questions and answers. Your questions can be submitted via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. In the interest of simplicity, we've disabled the chat function this evening, so please do remember to use the Q&A. Our speakers will get to as many questions as time allows. And now I am so very pleased to turn the floor over to our speakers. Thank you and good evening.
Thank you very much, Louise. I'm Alberto Ibargüen. Thank you, my old and dear friends, Barbara Lee Diamonstein and Carl Spielvogel. It's a great pleasure to be virtually back in New York, and an even greater pleasure to be here with my friend and my former colleague and a man I much admire, Marty Barron. We are actually still sort of colleagues because Marty is a trustee at Knight Foundation, where I'm president, and so I have to be careful a little bit, perhaps not too much, that I'm in a sense, and I warn you, Marty, I only take this in a sense, interviewing my boss. Welcome, all of you. Marty, I think as a good newspaper editor, you are known for your work, and you're known for the newspapers that you've led, but people don't know very much about you yourself. I wonder if, since this is a small conversation with several hundred people we haven't met, of our dearest friends, maybe we could start with a little bit of a biographical background. Tell us something about where you grew up, where your parents, where are they from, and how you got your start in journalism.
Sure. Thanks, Alberto. It's great to be with you, and thank you to the New York Historical Society for having me. Well, I grew up in Tampa, Florida, and I was born there within a few months after my parents arrived in the United States. They had immigrated from Israel. They had stopped in Paris for 2 years, but came to the United States in 1954. And my father had left Germany in the early part of 1937, went to what was then Palestine. My mother was actually born in what was then Palestine. And then they decided to leave and ultimately came to the United States. I think the fact that they were very much engaged in the world, the fact that we traveled, the fact that they were always attuned to what was happening around the world, and also keenly interested in what was happening into this country they had come to, that piqued my interest in public affairs. We had a media diet in our family. We got the daily newspaper, the local newspaper in Tampa. We got Time magazine every week. We watched the news, both local and national. It was always the Huntley Brinkley Report at the time on NBC, and then the local news as well. And then there were a bunch of other publications, in the household as well. My father was involved he was in the export business of Florida citrus, and so he was engaged with sort of foreign affairs as well. And so I got interested in that. And
did you grow up thinking that you were, this is going to be a conversation, so I'm going to interrupt you a lot.
Oh, you can interrupt. Go
ahead.
I'm very accustomed to this, of course.
which will bring you pleasant memories of
exactly.
when I was your publisher.
Yes.
But did you grow up thinking of yourself as a child of immigrants?
Yeah, I did actually. I didn't really notice it growing up, but everybody asked about my parents' accents. So yeah, I did. And we traveled a lot to Israel at the time to see my mother's parents. My father's family had passed away already, but we went there a lot and traveled a lot. And so I did think of myself as a child of immigrants. Absolutely.
And has that informed, I can't imagine that it hasn't, has that informed your coverage and the way you think about the stories that the Washington Post does now on immigration?
Perhaps, it's hard to say, but I think it has in the sense that, my father saw tremendous opportunity in the United States. They made a home here. I think they very much contributed to their own community. And so I always think about the kinds of contributions that people who come to this country can make, and that they can help make communities better, and they can make the country better. And so, yeah, I do think of that.
Yeah. It's hard, obviously, not to, and one of the reasons I wanted to ask you about your background is that it seems to me that it is directly related to obviously to the man you became. You went to Lehigh and then took a job at the Miami Herald, as I recall.
Correct.
And from there you ended up in Los Angeles.
Right.
Not the usual route.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the Miami Herald made me the best offer. The best offer was to work in the little town of Stewart, which had, I think at the time, 12,000 people in the entire town. It was a very competitive market, believe it or not, for all the newspapers in Florida, which were then competing in places like that. The entire county, Martin County, had 50,000 people. There wasn't a lot of news, but we needed to publish 6 days a week. I had one colleague there, and we had to publish and fill a page 6 days a week, take our own photos, write a couple of stories a day.
That's great. And when you went to Los Angeles, you went from general reporting to, you eventually became business editor there, right?
Right. Yeah, I went out there as a business writer. I'd been a business writer at the Miami Herald when I left. I became one because I had gotten an MBA in addition to my undergraduate degree. And so the Miami Herald had thought when they had an opening for a business reporter, they made me one. And then I went out to LA. The business reporting was expanding. They were adding a new section. And so I went out there and I spent, 17 years at the LA Times in different positions, working in New York and Wall Street, covering Wall Street and corporate America in the early 80s during the big takeover, the M&A wave, and during the world debt crisis and all that. And then I went back and I became business editor of the LA Times. And I left in 1996.
And from there to when you and I met, you were the night managing editor at the New York Times. You had moved back east up to New York, and and as I recall, one of the things that first piqued my interest in you is that you supposedly were the only person that had somehow managed to manage the Washington bureau of the New York Times. Is that a true story?
Well,
I know it's true that I heard that. I don't.
Well, I manage it. I mean, I had conflicts with them. So, yeah, I did have conflicts with them. It was regular. There were regular conflicts. So, yeah, I mean, look, I was a night editor. I was called the associate editor for the night. I was responsible for the paper at night. I was the most senior editor on site at the time. And, when you're up against deadline, the emotions get pretty high. You have to make quick decisions. Stories change, new stories develop. Some stories go on the front page. Some stories fall off the front page. Some stories aren't what you expected them to be. You have to make adjustments. Some stories need more reporting. There's a very limited amount of time to do that. Your competitor, when I was there, we would get a copy of the Washington Post front page, and if there was something we had to chase, we would have to chase it at 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night, or even later. So it was high pressure environment. So it's understandable that emotions would.
You did a phenomenal job as editor of the Miami Herald, and that's one no one needed to tell me about, because you're still the best editor I ever worked with, and I worked with a bunch. But you and I were here in Miami at the Herald when all hell broke loose and the INS took the little boy Elian Gonzalez back to his father and to Cuba. The town split, and the Miami Herald won the Pulitzer Prize for what I've always thought was cool-headed, arm's length reporting of the hottest story in the world at that point. And little did we know that we would be right in the middle of it again just a few months later with the Bush-Gore election.
Right.
As you think back on, and one of the things that really was notable about you, the way that you managed the newsroom throughout all of that, was the steadiness and the coolness of the approach, and the approach to the story, to just get the story and tell it unvarnished. I don't mean to gloss over that, because obviously that's a very important part of our friendship, our career together, but it also seems to me that it must have prepared you to some extent, or helped prepare you to some extent, for the kind of pressure you were going to be under when you went up to Boston as editor and took on institutional cover-up of pedophilia in the Catholic Church in Boston. And now you are in Washington, D.C. with covering an administration and a president who is famous for not holding back. How do you think about your performance in all of this? How do you think about your approach to a story and your approach to a staff, or your leadership of a staff in that kind of high pressure cooker situation?
Well, look, I mean, I think you have to develop thick skin. Certainly during the Elian Gonzalez case in Florida, there were pitched motions then, no question about it. We were coming under criticism from Cuban Americans who felt that we weren't sympathetic to the cause. We also were coming under criticism from so-called Anglos who felt that we were pandering to Cuban Americans. And so no matter what you did, you were going to come in for criticism. And I think that that prepared me for a lot of what I deal with on a daily basis, what I dealt with in Boston, what I deal with in Washington, is that you just have to do what you think is right. I mean, I'm a great believer in reporting, actual reporting, getting out, finding out what the real story is, and not getting caught up in the emotions of the community at large, and just trying to find out, get the facts, gather the facts, put them in proper context, and tell people what you found in a direct, straightforward way. But in order to tell people that what you found in a direct, straightforward way, you have to make sure that you've done a very rigorous job of reporting, and so that's a precondition, and that's what I believe in, is going out and reporting, and then you have a conviction that you've done all the right things, and then you stand behind it, as long as it holds up, and that's basically it. And so you have to have thick skin.
Do you think? Well, you've proven that. Every time I would call you to give you helpful criticism, you would show that thick skin and ignore me. But and I'm still sore. Not true. You've done that. You've lived a career during one of the most incredible revolutions in communications technology, perhaps arguably the most important revolution in technology since the printing press, and it's a technological revolution that has upended many newspapers, many careers, many people that you and I both know. It has changed how we think about what news is, the notions of objectivity that we held dear, of a process, seem to have been cast aside in many so-called news organizations. Tell me how after all of that, how are you defining what news is, as opposed to, obviously, as opposed to entertainment or opinion, but how do you think about news? How do you tell people to go about covering news and not offering an opinion piece?
Well, look, I mean, I think that's our job. I'm completely separate from the opinion side of the shop, and I think it's really important. There's been you mentioned objectivity. There's been a lot of discussion about that lately, and that that's a concept that is out. The notion that that's a concept that is outdated. But I actually don't think it's outdated at all. I think it actually has great applicability to what we face today. Objectivity, I think, is very much misunderstood, and it's been very much mischaracterized. It doesn't mean balance. It doesn't mean both sidesism. It really dates back actually 100 years, exactly 100 years, to Walter Lippmann, when he wrote Liberty and the News. And that was the idea that we all have pre-existing views. We need to recognize what those are, and when we go about our reporting, is that we need to set those aside, and that we need to do our reporting in an open-minded, thorough, and rigorous way. And that is to say, we need to do it objectively. He had in mind almost a scientific method, as much as possible, at least. And so, that means that we have more questions than answers. That means that we're inclined more to curiosity than we are to certitude. And so, that is my approach. And that's how I think we should approach things. Is how we should have our.
Isn't there a case to be made for a Black reporter having insight on Black Lives Matter stories, or a Jewish reporter having insight on coverage of Israel, or a Cuban reporter a Cuban American reporter bringing some additional, special, perhaps quite useful insight into the coverage of stories like that?
Well, totally. And I think, the objectivity actually recognizes that we're all limited by our own life experiences, that we need to be aware of how those life experiences limit us, and that we need to go listen and to report and to tap into information that that we may not otherwise have. I mean, I don't think that it's at all antithetical to the idea that other people bring different perspectives. In fact, I think it suggests an openness to other people's perspective, and a recognition that we have more to learn from than we already know. And so we want to have more perspectives from journalists of color. We want to have people with a wide variety of life experiences in our newsroom. And that includes, you know, that means in terms of race, it means in terms of gender, identity, but I think it goes beyond that as well. I think it goes to, you know, religion, religious upbringing, and class, and rural versus urban, and suburban, and to, you know, even veterans. I mean, look, we've been in war for so many years now, and there are relatively few people who have served in the military who are working in newsrooms. And I think it's really important that we have that experience. We have people with that kind of experience in our newsroom as well. And so I think we need people from all corners of American society so that we can hear their perspectives. And to me, that's not antithetical to the idea of objectivity. In fact, it's a fulfillment of that idea.
So in another time, there were institutions that you and I both worked at that had large staffs that vetted stories. The tip would come in. The first pass might not yield anything. Somebody would try to hide something. There would be a spin of the story. There would be lots of exploration. In a movie-like way, the crusty mid-level editors would say, "Get out of here, kid. I've been lied to that way before 10 times," before you finally end up with a story. Today, somebody calls in a tip, and before you can say whatever, it's already online, and it is not just locally known, it is known potentially around the world. How in the world can you have the kind of careful craft that I know you admire survive when you're competing with that kind of force and velocity?
Well, honestly, it's really difficult. And, you know, the public wants us to do a thorough job, but they also want their information instantly. And if you're behind, you get punished for it. And they turn to somebody else because they say you're slow. And why are you holding back? That sort of thing. So we have to be, look, we want to be fast. We try to be fast with our alerts and things like that, but we want to make sure that we're not putting anything out that we're not absolutely certain of. We make mistakes. We're a flawed profession like every other profession. I think we have to recognize that, but speed is a problem. It means that there's a greater likelihood of error. It means that there's the care of the editing is going to be less than it was before. Unfortunately, those are the conditions we live under and with, and we have to adapt to that. If we don't adapt to it, if we don't even embrace it, we just won't survive. So we try to make sure that we apply all our traditional principles to what we're doing day to day, but the risks are greater. There's no question about it.
Do you at the Washington Post have, or how would you, let me ask it this way, how would you compare the editorial process of a sensitive story at the Washington Post now versus, well, you weren't there, but say 20 years ago? Would they have a materially different approach?
Well, with major investigative pieces, I think we would handle it very much the same.
Yeah.
Obviously, we're not necessarily in a rush when it comes to that. And so we would have many layers of editing. We would have legal review. It would go back and forth many times over. And so I think that process is really the same. You know, the issue would be more sensitive stories that are developing stories. And that are fast developing stories. And, you know, that is, we try to be extra careful. We tell people that when it comes to sensitive stories, we'd rather we don't care as much about being first. We want to make sure that we're right, and that we are willing to risk being accused of being slow, as long as we can make sure that it's right. And we're not flawless, but that's our approach.
When people talk about the changes brought onto the newspaper industry by the technology, they usually are referring to what most people see, which is the end news product. But there's also a tremendous impact in the way the newspapers are put together and in the business of the newspapers themselves. I wonder if you'd be willing to share a little bit about the discussions that you might have had with your very famous owner, Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, who obviously is one of the masters of the universe on the digital side of business, and how he and you and your publisher approached the newspaper and what the Washington Post's focus ought to be when he first came in as the owner, and then a year or so later as you began to develop your plans.
Yeah, well, he acquired us in October 2013, and he immediately instituted a strategic change for the Washington Post. Our strategy up to that point had been to be primarily a regional newspaper focused on Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia, and we were actually shrinking given the economic environment of the time. He said that was a good model for the past, but it wasn't a good model for the future. That we had an opportunity to be a national and even international for a variety of reasons. One is that we were in the nation's capital, which is a good place to have a national news organization. That we had the name, the Washington Post, which is a name that can be leveraged to a national scale, unlike the names of a lot of other newspapers around the country. And that we had a history and tradition, a heritage that going back to Watergate, of shining a light in dark corners. So we had an identity. We didn't have to go off on a retreat. I mean, the implication was we didn't have to go off on a retreat to decide what our identity was going to be, thank God. And so that we're building on that, and that the internet was offering us gifts. It had inflicted a lot of pain on us. It had destroyed every pillar of our business, but that it also offered us a gift. And of course, our first thought was, I wonder, what gift is that? And he said, we were able to distribute nationally at virtually no additional cost. And so given the advantages that we had as an institution that I just talked about, why were we taking the pain and not taking the gift? And so we needed immediately to become national and international, and we needed to figure out how to go about doing that. And that meant being a publication, essentially a publication of the internet, and that takes advantage of all the nature of the internet, the way that people interact with news on the internet, how we distribute on the internet, all that sort of stuff. And so that's what we did. And as it's evolved, he gave an interview some years ago, where he was asked sort of the core pillars of how he thinks about us, and he said that we always need to be riveting, we always need to be right, and that we should ask people to pay. Because people should pay for quality information. And so that's pretty much our approach. Is we try to be riveting. We want to make sure that we're right, and that we do ask people to pay, because we think that quality journalism should be paid for.
We've got a relative. There are lots of interesting questions in that riveting and right.
Yeah.
The asking people to pay is perhaps the simplest of the trio, but in the decision about right, in a moment when you can have authoritative sounding information instantly available to you for any kind of position you might want to take, it's hard to always know what's right, and what's riveting may in fact be an accurate description of heat and fire, but not necessarily of light.
Well, he wants both together. So that's the thing. We don't want to be riveting without being right. And it's not good enough to just be right and be boring. So, so we need to do both. And that's what he was
So
calling for.
did you think about that when you decided to start counting the number of times the President of the United States told a lie?
I didn't really, it didn't start under me. We've had the fact checker. It's been run by Glenn Kessler for years now, well before I got here. But we had a president who, during his campaign, leading up to the 2016 presidential election, was saying a lot of things that just simply were not true. And so the fact checker team, we've had to grow the fact checker team. We now have 3 people working on it. They've never been busier. They just counted 50 falsehoods a day coming out of the president. So it's our obligation to tell people what the facts are. And so particularly when it comes from the most powerful person on earth. And so, that I think one of our core missions is accountability, particularly accountability for people who are in government and people who hold power. That's why we have a First Amendment in the first place. That was the idea behind it. And so we feel an obligation to tell people, when he's not telling the truth, when he's lying, when he's misleading, what have you. And that applies, by the way, to politicians of the Democratic Party as well.
Many of the fact-checking organizations, some of which, as you know, as a trustee, Knight Foundation funds, are often dismissed or accused, both by the subjects of the fact-checking as well as by partisans of one side or another of simply telling a different version of stories. What kind of training, what kind of background does a fact checker have to or what kind of structure do you have to set up to make sure that you're not simply having the fact checker say, you say it's pink, I say it's fuchsia?
Well, just because an accusation's made doesn't mean that it's true. I think that, look, in our case, we have, and the fact-checking organizations that I'm aware of, they all have very experienced people. So Glenn Kessler's been a reporter for decades for the Washington Post. He's covered virtually every subject. And the rest of the staff, they've been reporters for a very long period of time and have a record of quality work and credibility. And so we rely on that. There's not a certification process. You don't need to get certified to become a journalist in the first place. But we look for reporters who have a history of accomplishment and experience and who are rigorous in the work they do and whose work stands up over time. And then there's an editing process. So they all, the team has an editor as well who reviews their work. And if they make a mistake, they correct it, which they've occasionally had to run corrections as well.
Interesting. And sitting there in Washington, almost, well, very much within walking distance of the man you cover most, who expresses doubt about your integrity, about the integrity of the electoral system, which, although it's not run by the federal government, it's an election for the highest federal office. How do you keep the staff focused on that as a management question? How do you keep the staff focused on ignoring the attacks, or like the attacks on a fact checking, and simply keeping nose to the grindstone and doing the work?
I don't think they have a problem in that regard. I think that the people on our staff are professional. By being a journalist, you often come under attack, perhaps not as frequently as we do with this president. In fact, not at all as frequently as we do with this president. By the way, he hasn't expressed doubts. He's absolutely certain that we are There's no doubt in his mind, as best I can tell, that we're garbage, enemies of the people, the scum of the earth, the worst of humanity, whatever phrase he wants to use. Traitors, he's used that. You know, at some point, it becomes background noise, to tell you the truth. My only concern is when he individually calls out a particular reporter, which is a deliberate attempt to subject them to harassment and threats and potential attack. And that's most concerning to me. But when he, you know, makes these sort of broad statements about the press generally, or even the Washington Post, at this stage, it's all become background noise. It's like living in New York and hearing the garbage truck go by at 5 o'clock in the morning.
And you don't even
you can sleep. You can sleep right through it. I speak from experience.
You focus on putting out the best report you can, as opposed to figuring out what happens to misinformation that other people are putting out. But one of the hot topics in Washington and I think around the country these days is precisely the issue of misinformation and disinformation. Given your there's hearings in Washington coming right up that will consider the responsibilities of the social media companies, of the platforms. Maybe we'll get sooner than later to the question of liability under Section 230 that famously frees, unlike other publishing enterprises, frees the internet companies and the platforms from liability for anything that appears in their publications or in their system or in their offerings, however you want to style it. What and again, I understand that your focus is on putting out your report, but you're in the middle of this, and and I know you've thought a lot about these things. But how do you see the feeling in Washington, the strange thing called apparently bipartisan interest in figuring out how to rein in the negative impact of so much misinformation, almost regardless of what side you look at this from?
Right. Well, look, I mean, there's a lot out there. I mean, I think that the people who are, some of those who are, I mean, let's say going after the tech companies, they're doing it with political motives. Some of it is well-intentioned. The fact that we have a social media ecosystem now allows false information to circulate around the world instantly. And I'm not just talking about just Facebook or Twitter or what have you, but some of the other lesser known social media outlets, 4chan, 8chan, subreddits out there, things like that. So, and I think it's very difficult. And I don't know to what extent that the government can do anything about it. I think that we get into trouble if we say that we want the government to be the arbiter of what's truth and let them decide. That would be a very risky proposition, I think. So, I mean, I think at this point,
why is it more risky for them to decide what is to have the responsibility for deciding whether something is true or not, any more risky than it has been traditionally for other publishers?
Well, because the government has political interests at stake.
No, the government.
Do I want this government deciding what's true and false?
No. I didn't mean.
And do I want any government deciding what's true and false? I don't.
I agree with you. I mean, why not have liability attached?
Oh, I see. Liability protection
to the private enterprises that are facilitating this information.
Look, it's a reasonable proposal to say let's revoke Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which came into existence, I guess it was in 1996. Is that right? And that allows these internet intermediaries like Facebook and Twitter and others to essentially host all sorts of commentary or statements that they are not held responsible for. I mean, certainly these technology companies have been able to enjoy the revenue without bearing any responsibility, unlike other publishers, unlike ourselves. You know, I mean, I guess that's a decision that the American public has to make. I don't actually have a fully formed opinion on that. I worry that I think that if we revoked Section 230, we probably would not see the kind of any commentary whatsoever. A lot of what YouTube might actually just like vanish. Facebook would, in many ways, would vanish. People might consider that to be a really good thing, but other people might not, and because they don't have the capacity to monitor the billions, the hundreds of millions and billions of comments that are appearing on their sites all of the time at all hours of the day and night in every country in the world, and that is just impossible to do. And so if we said, look, we don't want any of this anymore, that's certainly a choice that the public can make. And certainly it's not as if the world can't live without it. We live without it. But the world at the moment seems to, they seem to want, you know, the sites to be able to monitor everything that's said on their site and to make judgments, essentially publishing judgments. But they also want an opportunity for essentially unlimited free expression, and those are in conflict. I mean, they're just in conflict. And
well, and maybe it doesn't need to be a black and white, an on and off switch, and there is some possibility for limited liability on the way to liability.
Maybe, I don't know.
That says this is the cost of doing your business. The cost is you must not do the harm that is being done in society.
That's quite possible. I just haven't seen a proposal that seems to accomplish.
Yeah, nor do I know if we have the technology to do it. But I'm pretty sure we're not going to invest in the technology to do it until there is an economic incentive for the companies to do it.
No doubt.
Tell me something. We can't. We're starting to get some other questions from the audience, and I'm delighted to see that. But I need to ask you just one last question about election night.
Yeah.
And what in the world are you going to do? You and I let go of the edition that said Bush wins for about 17,000 papers of the Miami Herald, or 14,000 papers, before we decided we couldn't call it any more than anybody else, and we stopped and said too close to call. What are you going to do this time? What are you getting ready?
We're going to be super careful. I mean, we're preparing for every contingency we can think of, both leading up to the election, the night of the election, that election night, as well as the aftermath. So we're trying to think of every conceivable thing. We're looking at, you know, to what extent there's voter intimidation, to what extent there might be violence, to what extent there might be, you know, what ballots are being counted, what ballots are being disqualified, you know, to what extent voters might be obstructed in any way. And I'm talking about, you know, we're looking at all the legal challenges out there. We have reporters in dozens of states right now monitoring all of this. And so we're going to be super careful with what we say. We will say very explicitly on our site that the data that people are seeing may not be indicative of the final result because there are likely to be a large number of mail-in ballots still outstanding. In fact, we have a model that's been constructed where we actually will estimate the number of outstanding ballots, and we will show that in tandem with the results that have appeared, so that people know that that those results they're seeing may be far from the final results. So we're going to be
theoretically
super careful.
You'd be able to see for all 50 states how many absentee ballots have still not
How many
been
ballots
counted?
are still outstanding? Yeah, we've modeled. Yeah, so yeah, so so the numbers you're seeing at any one time could be far from the final result. and because there's still many ballots outstanding. Because there is the risk that, it's possible that the president will declare victory before all ballots have been counted. And, we're going to be super careful with that. We'll be super careful about calling states. We're going to be super careful about everything. And by the way, we're going to be super careful with the security of our own people who have come under attacks and threats consistently over the last more than 4 years, going back to the campaign leading up to the 2016 election. So we're concerned about that as well.
Well, the focus on the facts, I think, is what is the way forward. And it's interesting. The first question from the audience is, how does the press overcome this period when a significant portion of our country has been convinced that what is published is fake news? Actually, Knight Foundation and Gallup just published a poll that I know you saw that showed a significant portion of Republicans believe that people on the other side are actively seeking to damage the country, and a very significant number of Democrats believe that the people on the other side are also trying to damage the country. It is not simply a matter of disagreeing. We've come to a point where, at least according to this Knight Gallup poll, people believe the other side is actively trying to do harm to the country. That's a tough place to write facts on, isn't it?
Yes, we're in an incredibly difficult environment for that. I mean, we're in a situation where certainly the president has tried to disqualify every arbiter of fact. The press is right at the top of the list for disqualification in his view, but we're not the only ones. Judges are out there, historians are out there on the list. Scientists are now there, doctors are there. They're all being disqualified. Intelligence agencies, you name it. And we're at a point where we can't even agree. We can't agree on basic facts. It was Daniel Patrick Moynihan who said, was paraphrased the other day by Vice President Pence, that you're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. I don't think he credited Daniel Patrick Moynihan, but that's where the line came from. And so, but people now feel they are entitled to their own facts. And we can't even agree. It's not that we can't even agree on basic facts. We can't even agree on what is a fact and what constitutes a fact. And how do you establish that something is a fact? And that's a very dangerous place to be as a democracy.
There's a question from one of the audience about the Bob Woodward, not about the book, but about the decision to hold back releasing his interview with Donald Trump on COVID-19 back when he first got it, before the book was published. Do you have an opinion you'd like to share on that, or?
I really don't. I mean, Bob writes these books independently of the Washington Post. It's his call on whether to do it or not. I think that he was trying to draw a bigger, look, there are many stories that Donald Trump was warned about the severity of this pandemic. We published many of those stories. So to me, it was really interesting that he would acknowledge that and state it the way that he did. And I think that added to the public's knowledge in a significant way. On the other hand, it wasn't entirely surprising for me because we had published stories saying that he was warned. And so I think Bob wanted to tell a bigger story about this, about this president and this White House. And I think that's his call as the author of the book.
If he had been writing for the paper, if he had been writing the story on assignment, would it have been okay to hold it for some months until he got the rest of the story, or would you have gone?
Well, he wouldn't have been writing a book if he were working for us, so he would have been writing it as a beat reporter, and so in that instance, we almost certainly would have published it. But that's a different thing. He was, in this instance, he was trying to write a book about this president and this presidency, and I think that's a different thing.
I think his role as having become famous as a reporter and then now writing books, may be one of the reasons there's so much controversy about that decision. I glossed over your time in the Boston Globe, but I have a question here from a reader. That was only because of time. I know it was a fascinating story. and the reader asks says that you played an enormous role in uncovering the abuse by the Boston Archdiocese, and it was at your instigation that the investigative team stopped treating these as a series of stories and treated it as a continuum of institutional abuse. Would you comment on the challenges you faced reporting on that troubling story and taking on such a powerful institution, especially in Boston, of all places in the United States?
Sure. Well, look, I mean, when I got to Boston, I didn't know Boston very well. I knew it hardly at all. I mean, I certainly knew that the Catholic Church was then the most powerful institution in all of New England, and had been for a very long time. So, you know, you go into an investigation like that with that kind of recognition. That said, you know, when you realize that there's a major institution, a powerful institution that may have committed severe wrongdoing, we as a news organization have an absolute obligation to investigate that. We have a greater obligation to investigate it, the more powerful the institution is, because that institution can do much more harm. So, you know, I think in that instance, we also had to remember, and I think this was one of the trickiest areas, is that we're not just dealing with an institution, we were dealing with individuals. So we were dealing with the reputations of individual priests. And so we had to be especially careful to properly document, you know, the allegations against them and make sure that these were really credible allegations. And so, and that's really difficult. And it's also difficult to, you know, to talk to the survivors, the people who've been victimized. These are incredibly emotional experiences in their lives. Many of them didn't really want to talk about it. Many of them had never told anybody about it. And they were struggling to deal with it. And for many of them, the last thing they wanted is to have this kind of experience publicized to the entire world. So, so that was, you know, that was tricky. And on top of that, many of them had actually reached legal agreements with the church to keep their experiences confidential. In fact, that was the pattern and practice of the church, was to reach these confidentiality agreements, which would, the purpose of which was to silence people who had been victimized. So individuals had to come forward notwithstanding that agreement.
There's a terrific scene in the movie Spotlight where Liev Schreiber is playing Marty Baron, and the team has just told you a series of stories. As somebody who had worked in newspapers and who's known you, that was actually my favorite scene in the story, where you basically said, if you can put these things together, then you've got not just a series of tragic stories, but you've got the institutional corruption. How much of that scene was actually true?
Well, that was pretty true. I mean, not the exact dialogue. I mean, it's a movie after all. It's not a documentary, and there was nobody filming us. But essentially, the basic thrust of that was true, is that we could have published a story that said there were a large number of priests who had abused kids. And that's not what we wanted. What I wanted was a story that showed an institutional cover-up. That's what would take it. That's what would move it forward. That's what would have a real impact. It was not really new that there were cases of abuse by priests. This has been, you know, Jason Berry had written a whole book on the subject. The issue was, could we document that the church engaged in a pattern and practice of cover-up for decades, and we were able to document that. And so that's the story that we were waiting for. And we had thorough documentation of that, largely because we went to court to obtain those documents. And thankfully we were successful, perhaps against all odds. And so we were able to document it beyond a shadow of a doubt, and to survive any potential accusations of bias against Catholics or anything like that, because the most devout parishioners could see for themselves what the church hierarchy had done, what they had said, what they had written in their own memos.
One last question on this: when those stories first started to come out, I remember public sentiment in Boston was violently against you. When did that change?
I don't think that that's actually true. I think that there was more shock than there was. We were anticipating, as the movie reflects, we were anticipating a massive number of calls to our switchboard. We had switchboards in those days. Remember switchboards? So we actually expected, and we had the switchboard operators come in to take the calls, and there were very few calls. I think people, because of that documentation, we presented a powerfully persuasive case that the church had in fact covered it up for almost a half century. And so what we got mostly, which is also reflected in the movie, is that, because the movie was incredibly, I mean, it's still a movie, but they did a lot of research and they got it right. We mostly got a lot of phone calls from other victims and survivors who wanted to talk about their cases. And the public, including the most devout Catholics, mostly turned against the church. And that surprised us, because the Globe had been accused in the past of being anti-Catholic. It wasn't, but it had been accused of that for a similar kind of for a story about abuse, in fact.
In today's
so well documented, yeah.
In today's world of doubt and of distrust of institutions, what do you think the public reaction would be? Would it be, I know what I know and I don't care what you show me, or as the polls suggest, the one I just cited, yeah. Or would it be, well, all right, you've shown me something and I have to change my mind?
Well, I think in this instance, I think we would have been very convincing, because we did what we should always try to do in journalism these days, is present the evidence as fully as we possibly can. And this story was called, there's a guy, a professor at NYU by the name of Clay Shirky, who called this the first true internet story, because first of all, it was circulated around the globe instantly, but also because we were able to post all the documentary evidence online and people could read it for themselves. And so they didn't have to take our word for it. They just had to read what the church, what the bishops and the cardinal had written themselves. And that was convincing. And that's what we need to do now, is that we need to provide, you know, we've talked about trust, and I think it's very important that we put up original source documents, that we put up recordings that we have, that we put up a video. I mean, what if Bob Woodward had written that book and there had been no tape recordings? I can guarantee you that the president would have denied that he ever said that. But the fact that Bob had recordings of his interviews, his long interviews, his many interviews with the president, it was something that became undeniable. And to the extent that we can do that these days, we should be doing that.
There are a number of questions about the business of newspapers, and one question about your owner, about Jeff Bezos. We have just a few minutes, but could you describe his relationship to the news operation and to the editorial and opinion pages of the Washington Post?
Right. I have opinion. I have no idea. I don't get involved in that at all. I don't interact on that, so I have no clue. My sense is that the opinion page does whatever the opinion page wants. That's true on the news side. Is he doesn't get involved at all in our news coverage. He doesn't suggest stories. He doesn't suppress stories. He doesn't criticize stories. He doesn't critique stories. And I include in that stories about him and about Amazon. His very first meeting with the staff of the Washington Post, the town hall that we had, where there were hundreds of people, he said, he was asked about this, and he said at the time, you cover me like you cover anybody else, and cover Amazon the way you cover any other company. And he has reiterated that to me personally, and he has never violated that. And we've had many stories that are critical of Amazon, and I haven't heard a word from him about it, not one word about that, or our coverage of the president, who is, of course, has excoriated him entirely because of the Washington Post coverage. He's come under tremendous attacks because of our coverage. He hasn't said go easy on the president. He hasn't said go hard on the president. He hasn't said anything. He has left it up entirely to us to make our editorial judgments independently. And that's what we've done. And I have to say that I am very grateful for that.
You
mentioned
earlier.
I wouldn't have had it any other way.
No, I know you wouldn't have. You mentioned earlier that that he wanted the paper to be, or the news product, pardon my saying it that way,
right,
to be riveting, right, and ask people to pay. How does he, as a businessman and as a child of the internet, think of the fact that so much of the content of the Washington Post is available free on other internet providers, whether it's on Facebook or Huffington Post and all of its progeny?
Well,
what do you do about that?
It isn't so much. He does get involved in the business side of things. He does get, as evidenced by that story I told you, he does get involved in the strategy and in our business tactics, in our technology, in our marketing, and our pricing, all of that sort of thing. He's deeply involved in that, very knowledgeable about it. And, you know, I mean, not only is he somebody who knows the technology, but he's somebody who really understands consumer behavior. He runs a gigantic consumer business. So, we don't make a lot of it available for free. If you're on Facebook and you go through Facebook Instant Articles, you hit our paywall, just like you do anywhere else. Same thing on Google, and same thing in other places. The only place where you might find it is if somebody is actually paying us for that content and licensing that content. You know, there's some holes that we need to, or areas that we need to address on that front. But the general idea is that people should have to pay, and that we will do everything we can to ensure that they do pay, because we have to pay our staff. It costs an enormous amount of money to do the work that we do. There's no reason that journalists should be expected to work for free any more than anybody else should work for free. And if people are expecting professional work, they should pay people. They should support people as professionals.
Marty, we're just beginning and we're out of time. I appreciate your willingness to have this conversation. I would say that before we came on, you had said to me what I assumed you would say when I asked you if there was anything you didn't want to talk about, and you said just ask me whatever you want to ask. If you had said anything other, I would have said, what did you do with my friend Barron, who has got to have that same attitude in the job he's got now? Your commitment to full, accurate, contextual telling of the news is, it makes me feel good. It gives me hope. It gives me faith. Thanks to you, thanks to Louise Mirror, thanks to Barbara Lee Diamonstein, and thanks to Carl Spielvogel. Thanks also to the terrific tech staff that put all of this together, and to, of course, to all of the audience. Have a good night, and we'll see you at another one of these, perhaps in person.
Thanks very much. Thanks,
Hello.
Alberto.